fault. Yeah, you staged it. You staged it. Staged it. You staged it.
Keir Starmer had faced criticism before, but never like this. As he stepped from his car and walked towards the Parliament entrance, the atmosphere turned poisonous. Dozens of protesters lined the streets, and their anger wasn't polite disagreement, it was fury. Years of frustration exploding in one moment. Placards bobbed above the crowd. You sold us out. Labour is lost. Not in our name. The chants of traitor rang louder with every step, echoing against the historic stone walls of Westminster. Journalists on the scene could barely hear themselves over the noise. For a leader who had built his image on calm control, the chaos surrounding him was devastating. His pace quickened, his jaw tightened, but the jeers followed like shadows. What made this moment even more damaging was who these protesters were. They weren't just opposition voices. Many were former Labour supporters. People who had campaigned for the party, voted red for decades, and believed Starmer when he promised honesty and renewal. Now they stood outside Parliament, furious, accusing him of betrayal. Their anger wasn't random, it was focused. Every word was aimed directly at him, every chant a reminder that he had lost their trust. It wasn't a skirmish with political rivals, it was an uprising from his own base, and that's the kind of rejection that can destroy a leader's career. Inside Labour's ranks, the silence was telling. MPs walked past without comment, aides avoided cameras, and no one rushed to defend him in public. The truth was clear. Starmer's leadership was cracking under the weight of disillusionment. His positions on Brexit, his refusal to call for a Gaza ceasefire, and his sudden attempts to appear aligned with figures once condemned by Labour, like Donald Trump, had chipped away at his support. What once looked like pragmatism now looked like weakness, indecision and betrayal. And as the cameras rolled, the chants of traitor told the entire nation exactly how far he had fallen. This was no ordinary protest. It wasn't violent, but it was humiliating. The kind of humiliation that can stick, replayed endlessly on social media, turned into memes and hashtags that spread faster than speeches ever could. Already, the clips were going viral. Starmer walking stiffly through the gates. Protesters screaming, "Traitor!" at the top of their lungs. Millions watched it unfold in real time, the sound of betrayal echoing through phones and televisions. For Starmer, this wasn't just another bad morning. It was a defining moment, a public rejection in the very heart of British democracy. And once that label of betrayal takes hold, it is almost impossible to shake. The noise outside Parliament did not fade when the doors shut. Through the thick glass and the grand corridors of Westminster, the chant still carried. Even inside, aides and staffers could hear it faintly. "Traitor! Traitor!" A rhythm that refused to die down. It wasn't just a protest anymore, it had become a soundtrack to Starmer's leadership crisis. Every step he took inside the chamber felt smaller, weighed down by the fury outside. Colleagues glanced at him, some with pity, others with calculation. The unspoken question hung in the air, how long could he survive this? The symbolism was devastating. Parliament, the seat of British democracy, had become the backdrop for a moment of public humiliation. The steps that once represented authority and power now served as a stage for rejection. Political analysts watching the footage pointed out the imagery immediately. A leader walking briskly into power's heart, stone-faced, while the people he claimed to represent shouted betrayal from the gates. It was cinematic in its clarity, the kind of moment that sticks in the national consciousness. And in politics, moments like these rarely fade. They define, they linger, they destroy. What made this moment even worse for Starmer was how quickly it spread. Within minutes, social media erupted. Clips of the crowd shouting "Traitor" were clipped, captioned and remixed into memes. The footage was shared with hashtags calling for his resignation, climbing into the top trends by the afternoon. Political opponents wasted no time. Conservative MPs mocked Labour's leader as out of touch, while Reform UK accounts branded him weak and indecisive. Even non-political commentators, celebrities and influencers joined the chorus, amplifying the humiliation far beyond Westminster. For millions across Britain, This was the only image of Starmer they saw that day. A man shamed by his own people. Inside Labour headquarters, the mood was grim. Staffers scrolled through Twitter feeds, WhatsApp groups buzzed with alarm, and MPs exchanged anxious messages. Some argued the protests were just a vocal minority, but others admitted the danger ran far deeper. The anger was not isolated to one issue. It was a culmination, a boiling over of frustrations that had been simmering for months. His Brexit stance, once blurred, had alienated both Leavers and Remainers. His refusal to call for a ceasefire in Gaza had alienated the party's grassroots. His attempts to appear moderate by borrowing language from the political right had confused and angered traditional supporters. To his critics, Starmer looked less like a principled leader and more like a man desperate to please everyone, standing for nothing in the process. The revolt outside Parliament crystallised those doubts into one unforgettable image. Protesters weren't there to hand in petitions or make polite requests. They were there to shame him, to strip him of authority in front of cameras, to send a message that no amount of spin or speeches could erase. We don't trust you anymore. And trust, once lost in politics, rarely returns. Even senior Labour MPs who once defended Starmer began to hesitate. Some quietly distanced themselves, avoiding interviews. Others voiced concern in private, warning that the protests could ignite something bigger, a leadership crisis, maybe even an open challenge. Meanwhile, the media machine went into overdrive. News channels replayed the footage again and again, each broadcast magnifying the humiliation. Headlines screamed, "Starmer branded traitor by furious crowd." Analysts debated whether Labour's base was fracturing beyond repair. Opinion writers described it as the beginning of the end, for his leadership. By evening, the chants outside Parliament had not only echoed through Westminster, they had lodged themselves in the national conversation. For Starmer, it wasn't just the noise that mattered. It was the silence of his allies, the whispers of rebellion in his own party, and the growing perception that his grip on Labour and perhaps his political future was slipping away. By the following morning, the humiliation had hardened into something far more dangerous. A narrative. Every major paper splashed the same headlines across their front pages. Traitor chants echo through Westminster. Star of Labour or face of betrayal? Star shamed by his own supporters. On television, the footage of him walking briskly through the gates, his face tight as chants of traitor erupted behind him, played on an endless loop. Political talk shows dissected every detail. His body language, his refusal to engage, even the slight tightening of his jaw. Some commentators called it dignity under fire. Others saw it as weakness, avoidance, a leader too fragile to face his people. In the digital age, perception is often more powerful than reality, and the perception now taking root was brutal. Starmer wasn't simply unpopular, he was untrusted. That single word, traitor, had lodged itself into the public imagination. It was repeated across social media, turned into memes, hashtags, and viral posts that spread beyond political circles. Even those with little interest in Westminster now recognise the image. Keir Starmer, Labour leader, being branded a traitor by his own supporters. Once a story like that gains traction, it grows legs of its own, and already it was running faster than his team could control. Inside Labour, panic set in. MPs who had once whispered doubts now spoke them openly in private meetings. Some warned that unless the party moved quickly, the damage could become irreversible. Backbenchers fretted about losing their seats if disillusioned voters deserted in droves. The party's grassroots activists, the lifeblood of any election campaign, were openly angry, some threatening to withhold support. Internal polling rushed in overnight, painted a bleak picture. Former Labour voters weren't simply undecided, they were defecting. Some to the Liberal Democrats, others to Reform UK. The message was clear, the protests outside Parliament weren't just noise. They were a warning that Labour's base was fracturing at its core. Meanwhile, the Conservatives pounced. Government ministers seized the opportunity, mocking Starmer during interviews and framing him as a leader rejected by his own. In Parliament, Tory MPs sharpened their attacks, preparing to use the footage as a weapon at Prime Minister's questions. If he can't command respect from his own side thug, one minister sneered, How can he ever hope to lead the country? Even Nigel Farage joined in, gleefully amplifying the humiliation on his platforms, declaring it proof that Labour under Starmer was finished. The opposition leader, who only months earlier was being described as the man most likely to lead Britain into the next election, was now fighting for his political survival. But the danger for Starmer wasn't just external, it was the growing rebellion inside his own party. WhatsApp groups buzzed with speculation. Senior figures debated whether he had lost control completely. Names of potential successors were whispered with increasing confidence. Figures who, only weeks ago, wouldn't have dared to challenge him. What was once unthinkable was now a possibility that Labour could face a leadership crisis months before the next general election. The chants outside Parliament weren't just an embarrassment, they were a spark, and inside Labour's ranks, that spark threatened to ignite a firestorm. For Starmer himself, the challenge was clear. He could no longer dismiss the protests as fringe anger or treat them as a minor disturbance. This was something deeper, an erosion of trust, a loss of authenticity, and a rejection that had now gone public in the most humiliating way possible. The more he tried to carry on with business as usual, the weaker he looked. And the longer he waited to act, the louder the chants of traitor seemed to echo, not just outside Parliament, but inside the very heart of his own party. As the hours turned into days, the shock of the protest gave way to something more dangerous: momentum. What began as chants outside Parliament was now echoing through community halls, local party meetings, and activist networks across the country. Grassroots groups, once loyal to Labour, began openly discussing coordinated actions against their own leader. Online forums that had quietly grumbled about Starmer for months suddenly surged with new members. Calls for fresh demonstrations gained traction, and within days, organisers were planning to return to Westminster with even larger numbers. What had started as humiliation was threatening to become a movement. Inside Labour's ranks, the mood darkened further. Senior MPs who had held their tongues could no longer ignore the tide. Some cautiously hinted in interviews that Starmer needed to listen more carefully to the public. Others, off the record, went further, suggesting that his leadership might already be beyond saving. In hushed conversations, the talk was no longer if there would be a challenge, but when? The fact that such whispers were spreading so openly was in itself a sign of how weak his grip had become. Starmer had promised unity, but what his party now felt was division, and it was spilling into the open. The timing could not have been worse. Polling, already shaky after the Southport debacle, began to slide again. Focus groups revealed something more troubling than low approval ratings: distrust. Voters weren't just unsure about Starmer, they felt betrayed by him. To many, he appeared as a politician without conviction, a leader trying to be all things to all people, and in the end standing for nothing. His Brexit tightrope walk, his refusal to demand a Gaza ceasefire, his flirtation with language that echoed the right. It all added up to a portrait of a man whose compass spun whichever way the political winds blew. For a party that prided itself on principles, this was poison. The Conservatives wasted no opportunity to pour salt into the wound. Government ministers and Tory backbenchers blasted him relentlessly. At Prime Minister's questions, the humiliation outside Parliament was weaponised. "How can the right honourable gentleman claim to lead this country?" the Prime Minister jeered, "when his own supporters call him a traitor outside his front door?" Laughter rippled across the chamber. Cameras captured Starmer's expression, a strained smile that fooled no one. The ridicule stung because it rang true. His authority was crumbling, and everyone knew it. Beyond Westminster, the images of that day continued to spread like wildfire. Viral clips were replayed on talk shows, dissected on radio, and argued over in pubs and workplaces. The word traitor had escaped the protest and entered the national vocabulary, now tied indelibly to Starmer's name. Even those who weren't deeply political absorbed the image of a leader hounded by his own. In politics, perception is everything, and his was turning toxic. Supporters, who once gave him the benefit of the doubt, began to waver. Opponents sensed blood, and within his own party, ambitious figures saw opportunity. In the private corridors of Labour headquarters, the atmosphere was described by one insider as funereal. Staffers spoke in whispers. Phones buzzed with speculation, and strategy meetings dragged on with no answers. Some pressed for a bold reset, an unapologetic speech, a radical policy shift, a decisive act to reclaim authority. Others argued that such moves would only inflame the anger further, making him look desperate. Starmer himself remained outwardly calm, carrying on with his duties, but behind closed doors, aides admitted he was shaken. The protests hadn't just rattled him, they had exposed him, and that exposure carried a deadly political risk. For once a leader becomes the symbol of betrayal in the eyes of their own base, the spiral is almost impossible to reverse. Each day that passed without a clear response allowed the word traitor to sink deeper, not just into the chants outside, but into the bloodstream of British politics. The revolt was no longer just outside Parliament, it was growing inside Labour itself. And with each whisper of dissent, each headline of betrayal, the countdown on his leadership ticked louder. By the end of the week, the storm around Starmer had transformed into something uncontainable. What began as a handful of furious chants outside Parliament had now swollen into a full-blown political crisis. Social media blazed with hashtags like #Starmer resign, Labour betrayal, and most damaging of all, @Traitor Keir. Every trending topic, every viral clip, every late-night joke show seemed to circle back to the same image. Britain's supposed Prime Minister in waiting, walking briskly into Westminster, pursued by his own base, calling him a traitor. The narrative had slipped beyond his control. Starmer was no longer shaping the story, he had become the story. The pressure from inside Labour intensified with brutal force. 40 MPs, then 50, then more, openly questioned his direction. Constituency Labour parties passed motions of no confidence in their leader, a move unthinkable only months earlier. Veteran members of the party privately warned that if he didn't address the growing revolt, his leadership could implode before the next election campaign even began. In politics, loyalty is currency, and Starmer's account was rapidly running dry. Allies who once defended him on air began to grow quiet. Silence in politics is often louder than condemnation. Meanwhile, his opponents circled like vultures. Conservative ministers mocked him relentlessly, painting him as weak, indecisive, and out of touch. Nigel Farage seized the moment to launch fiery attacks, calling the Labour leader a hollow man leading a hollow party. Even within Labour, ambitious figures who had kept their ambitions carefully hidden began to test the waters. Names were floated in the press, leaks trickled out of strategy meetings, and anonymous briefings hinted at a potential leadership contest. The scent of blood in the water was unmistakable. Starmer attempted damage control. Advisers pushed for a carefully crafted speech, an effort to reframe the narrative, to remind Britain of his vision for the future. But by the time the cameras rolled, the damage was already done. Viewers didn't hear conviction, they heard calculation. The man on stage did not look like a leader regaining control. He looked like a leader desperately clinging to it. Every word was dissected, every phrase compared to the chants that had shaken Westminster days earlier. The contrast was devastating. While protesters outside roared with raw conviction, Starmer's speech landed with the weight of hollow rehearsals. The fallout spread beyond politics. Pollsters recorded a sharp decline in trust. Business leaders, once cautiously optimistic about a Labour government, voiced concern over instability. International observers noted the unrest, with foreign outlets running headlines about Britain's opposition leader being branded a traitor by his own people. The story had gone global. And in the modern world, once a leader becomes an international symbol of weakness, recovery is almost impossible. By the final days of that week, whispers had turned into open declarations. Starmer's leadership was on borrowed time. Party insiders spoke of a countdown, the inevitable moment when pressure would reach breaking point. More protests were already planned, bigger and louder, each promising to escalate the humiliation further. The chants outside Parliament had become the anthem of a revolt that refused to die down. For Keir Starmer, the crisis was no longer a question of whether he could ride out the storm. It was a question of whether he could survive it at all. And as the lights of Westminster burned late into the night, one reality was becoming unavoidable. The man once hailed as Labour's future was now fighting not just for credibility, but for political survival.